In Luke 22, verses 14 through 16, one of the things that we see is Jesus talking to his disciples, not talking to them as individuals who are necessarily on some kind of big mission or on some speaking tour, but talking to friends, saying, I wanted so much to be able to celebrate this Passover meal with you, but I will not be able to celebrate it again until its meaning has been fulfilled. Those words are something that we shouldn't take lightly. It's something that directly connects what Jesus Christ did in the Last Supper with what so many individuals knew about Passover up until that point. It's with this significance that we celebrate communion. You see, with communion, what we do is we don't just look at a piece of bread and say it's a neat little metaphor for Christ's life. Instead, we look at it in the exact same way that Christ discussed it with his friends. Picking up a piece of matzah, something that a lot of Messianic Jews today will even look and relate to the individual of Christ, noticing that it's even baked in a way where it has stripes, that can remind us of the stripes of the whip, for Jesus Christ. And, the piercings that go into making the matzah, which reminds us of the piercings that Jesus Christ would suffer hanging on the cross. And you see, he would take this piece of matzah that everybody in the room would represent the connection between God and his people. And he would take this piece of bread, and this is what he would do, breaking it and saying, this is my body broken for you. Do this in remembrance of me. And it's with this in mind that we do this in remembrance of him. Similarly, he took a cup, and it was a cup that contained, some kind of wine. And as he was blessing this cup, it's something that everybody else in the room would have known of as a redemption cup, something representing the redemption of God's people with their Creator. And he would take this cup and say, this cup is my blood shed for you. Do this in remembrance of me. And it's with that significance that we also do this in remembrance of him. Just as those celebrating the Last Supper understood that it was about so much more than just a neat little metaphor, today we should understand the full blessing of what Jesus Christ gave us when he instructed us to remember him in these ways, that we get to connect with him in a way that unifies us not just with Christians today, but with Christians throughout the ages. This is something that we are truly blessed to be able to do, and I hope that it blesses you today. The way the world reacted to COVID-19 is fascinating, and in some ways we're still seeing it unfold today. You see, you have a lot of things that, if we were to be honest with ourselves, like strip away all the politics and all the social dynamics of things, and I think there were several things within the COVID-19 pandemic that we were told that maybe just kind of made common sense. I mean, let's just take the mask issue, for example. I mean, masks. As soon as I mention masks and I make it sound like I'm going to share an opinion, I have no doubt that there are people who are listening to this video or are even listening to my sermon and don't clench up a little bit. Because you see, it's become so politicized, or there's like ideologies, or people have rolled it into their basic human rights. This whole idea of like, how dare somebody ask me to wear a mask, or to, maybe social distance from somebody else. How dare somebody ask me to, that I need to check my basic social hygiene. But these things all make perfect sense. I mean, we ask small children to wash their hands, to not touch their mouths all the time, and we tell school children to be more conscious of those around them. And if you're feeling sick, maybe you don't show up to school. This idea even of masks being something that was so hotly contested just a few years back is something that for generations, and even you could argue centuries, people never really had a problem with. Whenever you were in a situation where it seemed like there were individuals with infectious diseases, if you were in that area, medical personnel or somebody else who had to be in that type of environment, you'd slap a mask on your face. It wasn't that big of a deal. But yet, when it came to COVID-19, it became such a hot button issue. And why? Well, I think there's several different things that ironically maybe even relate to how we exhibit our faiths as Christians. Let me tell you what I'm talking about. We already mentioned the politics and the ideologies. People will sit here and say, well, I have this worldly political, ideology or philosophy, and because of that, I'm going to respond a certain way to something that should be common sense. On principle, I'm going to stand up for it. People do the exact same thing with their faith. Well, they'll sit there and they will let worldly ideologies take precedence over what God has called them to do. They'll sit here and say, oh yeah, well, I know that Jesus thinks that I should be forgiving of all people, and I know that Jesus thinks that I should serve all people, but I mean, come on. Those people earned where they are on the totem pole. Or those people are, they're making mistakes. Because they're making mistakes, that's why they're having to, deal with that, why they're poor, why they're, maybe dealing with some other tough issues in their lives. People will let these worldly ideologies seep into what should be a very clear-cut thing, which is God saying, why don't you just love each other? Isn't that beautifully simple and make common sense? I mean, but let's go back to the COVID-19 thing. One of the other things people would do is they would frequently look at these different restrictions in terms of their movement or social distancing or anything like that, else like that, and they would just say, I just don't want to do it. I just don't want to do it, so I'm not going to do it. It was all about them. It was all about what they wanted. Once again, with people's faiths, we do the exact same thing. We want something, and so we're going to go do it. And it doesn't matter that the individual who created the entire universe, the individual who created us, who created our minds, things that scientists and medical experts only wish that we could understand, that the individual who created all of that says, I have a certain way that I created people to work with each other and creation to work. And here's what you do is you love me and you love other people. And as long as you are doing those two things, you're doing good. And yet we'll sit here and say, yeah, I got that, but it's really hard. People are annoying. I don't want to love other people. They're really annoying. It's really inconvenient. And, even when it comes to loving you, I got it, but I got so many other things going on in my life, and I want to do those. So who are you to tell me that I can't do it? We end up forgetting that God is God, and we end up treating him as if he's just another variable in our life's equation. Well, let's do one more thing. So when you talk about the COVID-19 thing, once again, we already talked about, ideologies and people will let their convenience override things. But the other thing too is people will end up having this idea that they are owed or entitled to certain things. I have a right to do certain things. I have a right to act a way or not act a certain way. Then once again, we see that same thing relating to our faith with people, almost approaching the altar of God, with this attitude of like, oh yeah, God, I love you and I want to follow you. I want to do the things that you say, but I mean, come on. I want to be able to do sports. I mean, come on. I want to be able to participate in this club. I want to be able to enjoy these vices that everybody else enjoys. I want to be able to do these things. I mean, what's the big deal? Everybody else does it. And so, I'm entitled to it. They do it. It's just a common thing. God, come on. Don't you understand? And once again, you can see how we've started to forget the fact that God is God and we're not. This is something that I think is pertinent, especially when we start talking about what it means to actually have a relationship with Christ. Because when we have a relationship with Christ, we don't maintain our identity as being the same person that we were before. No. Instead, there's this phrase that now applies to us, that we are in the world but not of it. And this is a phrase that you end up seeing from, this prayer that Christ gives in John 17. And this prayer is something that you probably know of as the prayer on the Mount of Olives, or the prayer in the Garden of Gethsemane. And what is happening is Christ is praying these things knowing that he is about to be arrested on the eve of having to deal with all the events we know of that occurred on Good Friday, ultimately resulting in the celebration of Christ's resurrection in Easter. And when Christ is praying, he is emphasizing the fact that there is this idea of sanctification, of separation from us and the rest of the world. That we are no longer owned by the philosophies and the politics of this world. We're no longer owned by our own passions and desires of this world, and we are no longer governed by the rights and entitlements of this world. We are now aligned with God. The subject of sanctification is something that is really big. There are just gobs and gobs and gobs of different theology texts that are written specifically about sanctification. In preparation for this message itself, I actually wanted to pull one of these quotes out of one of the various texts I have and kind of offer that as a really good description, but there were just too many. It's such a big subject, and for good reason, because it is a fundamental aspect of what it means to have a relationship with Jesus Christ. This is something that you can find all across the Bible. You can find it in the prayer that we just talked about in John 17, and you can find it in the writings of, Paul and many other individuals, across all of Christendom. So what we end up really needing to do for the purpose of a message and a study like this is to basically get something that seems to really encapsulate the concept. And where I go here is something that Paul says that I think is interesting. There's this idea of being inside and outside of the camp. And it doesn't necessarily mean the exact same thing as what a lot of people think when they just kind of hear that phrase. One of the things that we see Paul talk about in the book of Hebrews is he talks about sanctification in terms of Christ and him being an individual who suffered outside the camp. And what does that mean? Well, suffering outside the camp is a reference to something in the Levitical law where they would consecrate certain priests. Think of it, this isn't precise, but you can think of it as being similar to ordaining a pastor maybe. And when they were consecrating these priests, there would be a sacrifice that would take place. And so the sacrifice would take place and kind of the blood, which is where the thinking was the life is in the blood, the blood would be put on the altar in the tabernacle, and then the actual skin, so the body of that animal, would effectively be considered to have the sins of the individuals who are going to be consecrated placed on it. And because now it has the sins of the consecrated people on it, it couldn't be inside the camp. They would need to cast it outside the camp because it had the sin cast on it. So it went outside the camp, and there they burned it so that nobody could even eat the meat or enjoy it or anything. Well, what Paul is doing is he is explaining the concept of sanctification in much the same way, explaining that when Christ was put on the cross, he took on our sin. He took the penalty for our sin, and as a result, he suffered outside the camp. What's kind of interesting about this is quite literally he suffered outside the camp. Being crucified, it would have been something outside the city of Jerusalem. So he would have been literally outside the camp and also metaphorically outside the camp suffering. But as a result of that, he was also glorified. So we can see that Christ didn't go out there so that he could just maintain in a state of sin. No, is that he was out there and he was conquering sin. He was overcoming the penalty of sin. And so in the same way, what Paul is saying is that we too have to be willing to be outside the camp. In the same way that Christ suffered outside the camp but overcame sin, we also are unified with Christ. We are joined within that suffering outside the camp. And then now we are set apart. We are separate from everything else that's taking place. And so what this means in your modern world today is that we are individuals who have suffered with Christ outside the camp. But in order for us to do that, in order for us to really grasp what that means, we have to keep in mind that we are outside the camp. We don't exist completely unto this world. This creation is not everything that there is. We can't look at this as our actual home, but instead as a place that God has called us to. In the same way that God sent his Son to earth one day to return, we too are here. We're in this place here and now so that we could glorify God, so that we could do the work that God has called us to do. But our entire lives are not dedicated to the things of this world. And when you think about the impact that has on your life, it is absolutely massive. You're no longer a slave to the expectations of this world. You're not driven by the ideologies of this world, by the passions of this world. You're not driven by the sense of rights and entitlements of this world. You're driven by something that will actually bring you joy and contentment. When it comes to sanctification, it's kind of difficult because it's easy to say, but then when it comes to doing it, it is hard. I mean, I'm not going to argue that it's very easy to just simply say, oh, well, just, don't do things you're tempted to do. I mean, that's clearly not realistic. It is very difficult, and the world is so alluring, and the fact that we have grown up in it, that we live in it, it's something where it's kind of ensnared us. So it's so difficult when we feel like we have these expectations on our lives to extricate ourselves from that so that we can live in a way that God has called us to live. It's hard, bluntly, to make sacrifices. And sometimes if you're gonna have a life-altering relationship with our Creator, it means you're gonna have to sacrifice some things. But when we have those instances where we sacrifice, we have to remember that that's not just something that we should do begrudgingly, and it's not just something that we have to do and that we have to suffer through. That is actually an opportunity for us to demonstrate what is most important in our lives. It is an opportunity for us to exercise our faith and for us to prove to ourselves and prove to others through our testimony that we place God in priority, in a higher place of esteem than the other things of this world. And yeah, that's going to make you a little different. It might make you a little bit sanctified. So with that, I would point you to the last few verses that are there in verse 17. If you go and you look at those last few verses, you're going to see the end of Christ's prayer. To me, there's something that is absolutely beautiful in there. And that is that Christ prays for you. I don't mean you in the sense that, like, you know, some kind of broader global sense. I mean, like Christ prayed for you. When you look in here, they actually separate the prayer, theologians and scribes do, you know, where they end up saying that, you know, in the middle, he's praying for, you know, his disciples and what they're going to have to go through. And that's when he's describing this idea of sanctification. But then at the end of the prayer, he's praying for other Christians. He's praying for other individuals who are to come and other individuals who are going to be following him. And that includes you. That Christ, when he was going through all of this, when he was suffering outside the camp, he was praying for you, for the struggles you're going to have to go through. He was praying for the trials and the sacrifices that you're going to make. So Christ knows that this is not necessarily always going to be easy, but he also doesn't sit here and just watch you do it as a casual observer. He was an individual that was an active participant. He was the leader in the suffering. And as a result of that, when we go through these difficult situations, we're not doing it by ourselves. We're doing it knowing that Christ is right there with us, praying for us, that he is there, you know, supporting us, that the Holy Spirit is giving us that strength and that courage and that endurance to be able to overcome whatever it is drawing us away from what should be very simple, to love God and to love people. And so the question for you today is, when you sit here and you look at your own priorities, how do they stack up? Does it look like basically a bunch of stubborn individuals, you know, bickering over COVID-19 policies? Or does your life look like something that is special, that is different? Do you look like you are somebody that is outside the camp living for a better life? That's our lesson that we have for today. I hope you're able to get something out of it. Until we can meet again, God bless.